Hey guys, this is Nick Christopher from Mob Tales. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for your support. Please like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff. Today we have an interesting guest, a gentleman I bumped into on Crap Book. I call it Crap Book. It's Facebook, but I call it Crap Book. Um, really interesting gentleman with an interesting history. Alan, definitely appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for coming on.
It's great to be here, Nick. Thank you for the invitation.
No, not at all. And just to let people know a little bit about who you are, so before we get rolling, um, Alan, if I'm pronouncing the last name wrong, just tell me.
Yeah,
Alan
it's
Geik?
Geik. It's
Geik.
Geik.
I got it right the first time. Yeah, that's what she said.
Most
Anyway,
people don't.
yeah, well, Alan Geik is, he's a New Yorker, grew up around the life, but with the Jewish guys, not so much the Italians, but the Jewish mob, but in a really direct way because his family was connected to that world. So that's what we're going to be kind of talking about today. It is sort of an introduction to this book right here. It's, if anybody can see it, it's called Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, which is pretty interesting. A lot of our viewers are into that, Murder Inc. and so forth and so on. So, Alan, the questions I want to ask you, the first one basically, because I've been reading the book and I like it. And I'm very particular about reading books like this
Thank you.
because I grew up around that world, so I know too much about it.
Mhm.
Uh, and I'm very critical about certain books that are written about that world. So um, I'm like at page 90 right now, and it's pretty damn good. It moves quickly. It's an easy read. A lot of stuff in there I already know, but that's irrelevant. Um, but a lot of stuff in there I don't know. The characters that you mentioned, like Uncle Charlie, Uncle George, Sammy, Ruby, all these people, I didn't know anything. I didn't really know who these people were beforehand. Only because they were in the shadows of Meyer Lansky, of AR, what do you call it? Oh my God, Waxy Gordon, all these, they were like in the shadows of these characters because these other guys, of course, were like everyday, household names. So my question is, being at that age, 10, 11 years old, going to the restaurants and hanging out with Red Levine and all these characters, and your dad was obviously related to Uncle George, his brother, I believe, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Now, being at that age, because I know when I was at that age is when I first got introduced to that world myself, 12 years old, roughly. When you were sitting in the restaurant with Red Levine, hanging out with him, listening to him talk, um, what was your first impression?
Well, it was all normal to us. Uh, I knew who he was probably from the time 10 or 11, the age you just asked about. My brother was a little older than me. He became a detective, and my sister was a couple of years younger than me. But these people were normal. We talked about Uncle Charlie, who was in jail for killing Dutch Schultz. He did 23 years. He was sort of a legend of sorts. We met him when he got out of jail, but when I was 10 or 11, and you specifically mentioned Red Levine, and he had a bar on the Lower East Side called The Spot. It was on Grand Street. And we would go there every so often. It was sort of a grungy bar, and I always remember the smell of stale beer from that bar, which we all remember from bars in different times in our life. But Red had a very gruff exterior. He was really respected because he was one of supposedly one of Lucky Luciano's favorite hitmen, and he was called upon at some of the more legendary mob hits. But to me, he was Red Levine. A matter of fact, from that time that you mentioned, age 10, his girlfriend was my mother's best friend from high school.
Sylvia, right?
Sylvia.
Sylvia.
Sylvia Lauber, and Sylvia was anti-Maine to us. Years later, my sister, who's an attorney, had the chance to interview Sylvia about her life, and Sylvia was always into mob guys. Before that, it was a guy who was named Sammy Cass, who was very close to our family, who was Waxy Gordon's right-hand man, and got arrested with him. But specifically, I knew more about Red Levine's domestic disputes with Sylvia than I knew about him being Lucky Luciano's. It was a contradiction. It was always a contradiction, but it all seemed so normal to us. We were going to go see Red Levine. We were going to go see this other person who was very close to Meyer Lansky. Uncle George came to town, and he, by that point, was really a big shot in the Cleveland syndicate in Las Vegas. And so when he came, he attracted all these other people, and it all seemed normal to us for my whole life, actually.
Wow. Now, I mean, being that the case, I mean, your father, Lou, if I'm correct, didn't get involved in that world at all whatsoever. He was
No,
completely legit. So, you would, growing up, did your dad like kind of say, okay, listen, Alan, these guys are what they are, but don't go anywhere near this world or whatever. Was there ever some that kind of like fatherly advice? Stay away from that world.
there was motherly advice. My mother, who knew all these people from the time she was a teenager, because of my father married my mother when they were 19, and they were boyfriend girlfriend most of their teenage years. She was the one who always said, "You have nothing to do with these people." A matter of fact, when the Stardust opened in 1958, my uncle George wanted to get the concession, one of the concessions for my father, who was a manager of a shipping company and a music company, a music publishing company in New York. He wanted us to come out to Las Vegas, and my mother said, "No, no way are we going out to Las Vegas? We're staying in New York," which was a lucky break for all of us because I think we all did much better. But my father, I can't recall him. He took me to all these places. And as I mentioned before, it was normal. But to my mother, it was acceptable because these were family and extended family. And she treated them that way. But there was a place you couldn't go any further. One of them offered me a job in a bookie place. That was before when the gambling was illegal, because I was a smart guy. He said I was in college, and then I saw him a few days later. He said, "I saw your mother, and she said to me, I will kill you on the spot if Alan ever walks into that office." So that, I hope, is the answer to your question.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, do you recall who that gentleman was that offered you the job?
Yeah, his name was Marty Gaudia, and he was a guy who I knew most of my life. And he was a guy who who took bets, sports bets, way before sports betting, and numbers before the lottery took over a fair part of the numbers when so Marty was always part of the family too. And he thought he was doing us all a favor by giving me a summer job. But I did manage to get a summer job in the Painters Union. It was one of my first jobs, and it was totally corrupt. You know, it was a construction trades in New York back then were all controlled. And my father got me a job as an apprentice painter. Actually, the guy who was the representative of the union, I remember going to see him, Harry Altman, his name was. And Harry said to me, "Do you want to work as an apprentice?" He picked up the phone and he said, "Irv, do you need an apprentice? Well, you got one." And he's my nephew, Alan, and I spent the summer working in the Bronx at a project, sort of a middle-class project, Parkchester. That's what it was called in the Bronx. So that's sort of, my mother allowed that because that was okay. After all, I was a union guy. And I remember I made $62 a week as an apprentice, and it was huge. That was huge money at the time.
Yeah, back then, yeah, I'm sure it
Right.
was. Yeah,
Yeah.
no doubt. Well, like I said, meeting all these different people, um, and as you grew up, obviously, as you grew older, you obviously knew what the hell was going on, who was what they were doing.
Sure.
You knew even more. I mean, at 11, you knew, but even as you got older, you knew even more. Um, and I read, when reading your book, you had an opportunity, I don't know when exactly, that you actually were able to get stories from Sammy, from Charlie, from George, I think as well. I don't know if they're all still alive at this point, but probably not. But
No,
they, what time period was that when you were able to, before they passed, when were you able to gather this information to make this book possible?
that's a great question. I'm 80 years old now, as hard as it is for me to believe it in my head. But my bar mitzvah was in 1955. A lot of the photos in the book are these people at my bar mitzvah, and then their FBI photo is on the next page. And that sort of was a cheap thrill for me. But from the time I was about 16 or 7, maybe a little older, because by then I was going to bars in Midtown Manhattan, and the conversation would flow very smoothly about their views of organized crime at that time and when they were younger. And one of the catalysts to it all was my brother, who was 4 years older than me. And because of the organized crime connection with the family, he was on the fast track to becoming a detective. And he became a detective, one of the youngest detectives in, as he said at the time, and he wound up being part of the Special Investigations Unit, which was all busted. Out of the 75 detectives, 50 were busted. He was one of them, and they made the movie Prince of the City out of it. But my brother had very high level rabbis, as they would say, guys who watched out for him because they were associated with the organized crime figures. So my brother was had one foot in one world and the other in the other. And in regard to me, when I'd go out with my brother and my father, the stories flowed very smoothly because everybody there was understood the it was a family thing. And my brother, they really had an interesting relationship with him because after he got busted and left the police department, he became the manager of my father's trucking business, which itself had to be connected to that world, as I wrote about in the book, probably later on than where you're up to in the book. But to be a garment center trucker, you had to be connected. And my family certainly was. Johnny Dioguardi was the
Johnny
uh,
Dio.
Johnny Dio was the my father's friend from their childhood, and my Uncle George and Uncle Charlie. So Johnny Dio was the rabbi for my father's trucking business.
That's a funny, the fact that you even say that is kind of funny to think about. He was your rabbi, meantime he's Italian. The whole idea kind of sounds funny. People don't understand what that means. People who are not in the life don't realize what rabbi means in the organized world means somebody who represents you, how you say, you're on record with, so to speak. So your dad was on record with Johnny Dio, which is, who a better person than Johnny Dio? That guy was freaking seriously powerful. Um, Now it's interesting you say that, but your dad was not involved in that world. Wasn't an associate or anything at all. It was just that Johnny Dio, I guess, had a liking to your father, took a liking to him, and I guess also because of your uncle and so forth and so on. So, in retrospect, besides your mother's disapproval, you, your brother, your dad, were somewhat on the fringes of this thing. In some way, in some form, maybe in a very small form, but still was somewhat on the fringes of it. Not more so your brother and your dad, it seemed. because you're right. The garment industry was run by the Gambino family. They ran that whole damn thing in the Bonanos. They ran all of it. And not so much today as they did then, but they pretty much ran the show. Um, and the trucking business, forget about it. The trucking business was completely run by these guys.
Mhm.
So I think your dad really, in all essence, even if you wanted to avoid being involved with it, you couldn't because that's just what it was.
Well, it's interesting you say that because one of the points I made very early in the book was that Uncle Charlie, even though he wasn't a blood uncle, he grew up with all, my Uncle George, my father, Johnny Dioguardi. And when he was in jail, my father, because he wasn't part of that world in terms of getting arrested and all of that, he was one of the many people, I assume, who brought money to Uncle Charlie family for the 23 years he was in jail. Because, as you know, the guys who went to jail and did their time, their families were taken care of to one degree or another.
But
And my
back then,
father was, they wanted someone like my father who really had no mob connection in terms of arrests because they didn't know how it all would all play out with parole. And
mhm,
then when Charlie got out of jail, my brother was already a cop. He was a policeman. He was just on the road to being a detective and already was connected. And Charlie was concerned about um, the parole officers trying to make a name for themselves because he had a reputation still as a murder incorporated assassin. And he was afraid that they would put him back in jail. And my brother said to him, no, that's not going to happen. We got the connections in the police department to go to the parole people and tell them to chill. So he always called us his nephews. I was always his nephew, so I always called him Uncle Charlie, never anything else. But uh, the way they spoke was very out there, very open to us. And uh, when I think about it, it never occurred to me to write a book about it ever until more recently when I had an interaction with a cousin of mine and my sister. After 20 or 30 years, she showed me all of these photos of these people at my bar mitzvah and restaurants and family photos. And then she had a book called Mafia, which was put out by the Treasury Department.
the
Uh,
commission,
you probably know of it.
yeah.
And each page was dedicated to a different mob figure. And
Mhm.
as I went through that book, there were all the people at my bar mitzvah and who I knew for my whole life until they passed away. Most of them had passed away, let's say, in the mid 70s. Uncle George, my father died 10 years later, but Charlie Workman, Uncle Charlie, who killed Schultz, he died about 1979, Red Levine. So the era that, to get back to your question, the era was from mid 50s to the mid 70s, in which I knew them, and I would meet them in restaurants. Charlie, by the way, as I wrote in the book, uh, I lived by the Brooklyn Bridge, and my brother lived nearby too. And Charlie would love Chinese food, and he joked about when he was in jail for 23 years, he missed his family the most and Chinese food second.
Oh yes, I
Well,
remember you said that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we would meet, and the conversation, and whoever else showed up, people who I knew or didn't know, uh, we would hear a really firsthand account. I mean, their oral histories, as we would call it, were really exceptional when I think about it. And we had chances to verify different parts of it and discuss it. They were the subject of great fascination in my family. Even my parents would laugh about it because they knew them in a different way. They knew them as you know, your friends from teenage years, or
Hmm.
I would.
Right. But I remember you mentioned in the book that you said Uncle Charlie, Uncle George, and some of the other wise guys considered your father a civilian.
A civil, definitely.
That's what, yeah, well, that's how they term it. People
Yes,
who are not in the world, they call them civilians. You
but
know,
yet they could be called upon to do something that was on the edge of, and they knew where that edge was to not like have my father do so, probably, I'm assuming, go that other stuff. Running a trucking business, that was fine. There was nothing illegal about it. I mean, of course, you had to pay off the right people. You had to know the right people to pay them off.
Right. Well, to avoid union strikes and all of those fun
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, exactly. Um, Now, being around like Uncle Charlie, Uncle George, and knowing, not stupid, you knew what was going on, and knowing
Mhm.
this was going on, and seeing them with their rolls of money and their nice cars and their nice suits eventually, um, did that. I mean, I know what happened to me. I was very attracted to it. Like I wanted to be part of it to some degree. I was scared, but I wanted to be part of it.
Mhm.
Um, but you never crossed that line.
Never, no. It
Yeah,
never occurred to me either.
really. I mean, it never, you never like said, wow, look at Charlie. He's got this, he got that. Didn't you ever say, I want that. I want to be that big shot.
The big shot, well, first, it's interesting you mentioned Uncle Charlie because he was in jail for 23 years. He wasn't a good role model for me to be one of those people. I met him when he got out of jail, and he was more of he was just an ordinary citizen in a lot of ways. But the one who was the big shot, so to speak, was Uncle George, who was an associate of Meyer Lansky and Sam Giancana. I wrote with FBI documents to prove the points I was trying to make later in the book. But Uncle George, when he came to town, he stayed at the Essex House on Central Park South, and to us, from a five people in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, this was like really elegant. I mean, this was like really styling. We could order anything from room service we wanted. Nobody cared. That was the least of it. So, and then I'd go to see Uncle George and Aunt Mildred in Florida, and they had a boat dock. I mean, who in the Bronx had a boat dock? They had a yacht at the end of their thing. And Uncle George he was the one that my brother and my father, he was my father's older brother, and my father was always his younger brother who, was a clerk in a publishing company before he got into the Garment Center with Uncle George sponsoring him along with Johnny Diaguardi and other people.
Yeah, well, the other thing, with your dad, I know he was considered civilian, like you said. Now, people would say, well, your dad was so close to this world. I mean, so close. His own brother. So, and he ran businesses, garment business, like you said, trucking, whatever. Um, I'm not sure if you knew or not, but was he? I'm wondering if he was ever approached to say, hey, Lou, maybe you can do this, or maybe you can do that. Why don't you put this guy on your as a no-show job? Why don't you see maybe if you can clean some of this money? Because family and no family, they, especially these kind of guys, where they find a way to get in somehow with other family members. Because the reason being because they can trust them. You know, I'm wondering if that ever occurred.
It did occur actually, because in my father's trucking business, and I'm talking now, let's say late 60s through the late 70s, when I left New York and moved to LA, I would go to the Garment Center fairly regularly from the Brooklyn Bridge. I'd walk up to see people on the Upper West Side. That was my hang to walk. But when I would go there, my father had people working for him like Sammy Casa, who was at that point his closest associate was Fat Tony Salerno. I
Hmm.
wrote that in the book. Sammy Cass was probably the closest Jewish guy to Fat Tony that ever existed. And before that, he had gotten arrested, and there's a photo in the book, a famous bust with Waxy Gordon. And here he is after going to jail for 15 years. He gets out and he's working in my father's trucking company because he wanted something to do. And a few of the other guys were working there too, who were like the civilian brothers of mobsters who would be working there and checking out the garments going into the truck. You know that whole routine in the garment center. But I later on called my father mob adjacent because he was there, but he wasn't there. And in the book, my sister jumped out at me out of the box of photos. There's a picture of Johnny DioGuardi, his brother Tommy, and a long table of men and women at the far end of the table. And my father is sitting at the front of the table with Tommy and Johnny DioGuardi. And the photo was taken. I found out later, after the book was published, someone wrote and said, "Oh, the guy sitting next to your father is my uncle, and the guy next to my uncle is my grandfather, who was guys from Cleveland, and all the other guys were Uncle George's guys from Cleveland. There's my father sitting at the head of the table." So the answer to your question is no doubt there were some things that my father facilitated for them. And one quick story, Nick, if I could tell you, and I always remember it because we lived in the Bronx, and my father, he was basically a functioning alcoholic, as my brother was. I never really drank that much. I took other substances, but my father came home one day with a shopping bag. And in the shopping bag, it was filled with $100 bills. We lived in a $70 a month apartment in the Bronx. And it turned out that Uncle George and my father were drunk in a bar. And Uncle George, someone had given him a shopping bag, and he said, "Take this home with you." My father got in a cab and took it home. There was $35,000 in it. Now we're talking about, let's say, 1960.
Oh my God.
And $35,000 in the shopping bag, my father told me later on. And he told me to put it in at my grandmother's apartment, who lived a few doors away. So we left it in my, but there was my father with all, and this was no doubt scam at the time from Las Vegas.
Sure.
Because Uncle George was one, he was so trusted by Trigger Mike Coppola, as I mentioned in the book. Trigger Mike was my uncle's mentor. Let's call him that, my uncle's rabbi. And they were friends for life. And I forgot the point I was going to make, but yeah. My uncle was Trigger Mike's guy in Las Vegas, because Trigger Mike couldn't go there because he was in the Black Book, and Sam Giancana was in the Black Book. And I wrote about it because there was a newspaper investigative series in 1963 in the Chicago Sun-Times that was quoted extensively in a Senate hearing about Las Vegas criminality. And there it was. Uncle George was the stand-in for Sam Giancana and Trigger Mike in Las Vegas because they trusted him and they couldn't go themselves, and they didn't trust the other guys, the other Jewish guys running the Desert Inn.
That's interesting. That's funny. You know, I mean, being that the case, now your sister showed you all these photos. Iris, am I correct? Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, your sister married.
She never married.
Oh, she never married.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought she did. I thought you said she married. Maybe I got confused. No, I'm trying to think of who you mentioned in the book. A relative of yours that got married to somebody that was part of that world. Well, maybe I'm thinking of Sylvia. Maybe that's what I'm thinking.
Sylvia was always part of that world. My mother loved Sylvia, but she would never really want anything to do with these men's girlfriends. You know, they all had girlfriends. My mother knew their wives, and she thought it was very disrespectful for her to entertain in any way the girlfriends of these men. And my father knew enough never to take us. There's a joke at the Copacabana. You bring your wife one night and your girlfriend the other night. I forget which night was which. But my mother was always, and Sylvia was the only one that she allowed in our life without any barriers.
I mean, being that you grew up around that thing, and did you ever question your dad? Oh, Billy, what does Uncle George do? what is Uncle Charlie? What kind of work did they do? Did you ever question that at all? Did you ever inquire and were told, forget about it, don't worry about it?
No, actually, I was pretty aware of Uncle George's role. I didn't know, and I learned his history as I got older because my brother knew the whole story, my father did, and I would, by that point, know all of Uncle George's friends. And I got the backstory of Uncle George, how he became uh, such a big shot in Las Vegas. And his partner from when they were 12 years old, Ruby Collard, they were both petty criminals on the Lower East Side. And Ruby Collard became the president of the Desert Inn and tells Howard Hughes, he's the guy who told Howard Hughes he had to leave because basically they were deadbeats. They wanted gamblers, not guys who didn't drink and who didn't gamble. And Howard Hughes wound up buying all the hotels. But uh, I knew from the time I was much younger uh, who they were and basically what they did. And Uncle Charlie was in jail until I was 22 years old. So I knew what his backstory was. And when he got out of jail, he was never he they meaning or whoever in organized crime, as they did with many people, Italians and Jews, they gave them small businesses like button makers or tie manufacturers. That's when they had small manufacturing in the garment center, and they gave them these kinds of businesses to run.
Right.
And but I knew the backstory to all of them probably by the time I was 18 or 19 years old.
Okay. All right. But so basically, you never asked. You just knew.
I knew, well, if I did ask, I would get the story from my father. Well, so and so is, he was Lepke's favorite assassin 30 years ago, and okay, that's who he was, and now
Okay.
he's, yeah,
Well,
okay,
that's
right,
normal.
yeah, and it was just normal to me at the time because my mother's side of the family was in no way criminals. They were like your normal uncles and aunts who had their own whatever family politics, but they were no way involved in that. So
Oh,
I
very
did have a foot in a normal family life also.
interesting. So you had the one side, you had the rough and tumble Jewish side one side, and you had the nice little Jewish family on the other side. That's pretty funny. Um, I mean, as I read your book, I did realize that you mentioned that a lot of these guys, I granted it was their environment where they were born into, Lower East Side, stuff like that, like Ruby, Charlie, George, Red Levine, all of them. But I do understand that in the Jewish community, basically back then, or even now, but back then so much more, I think um, it reminded me of Once Upon a Time in America. It reminded me of if you ever see that movie where it shows how you know the good part of the Jewish community, and then you had these guys that were that it was just amazing. It's interesting of this how both sides were depicted in that movie, but also in your book because you talk about them going to the synagogue, and even one guy that was a big time Jewish wise guy that actually went to temple every week, and he wore a yarmulke.
A Red Levine,
Never mind, yeah, he always wore it
yeah,
under his Stetson hat, which is
under, yeah.
which is so much. It's almost hypocritical. It's like, which one are you? You know, um, and I'm sure your dad knew that, and I'm sure your mom knew that, and I'm sure you did too. Uh,
Yes.
I'm sure. You knowing this of being fact? Um, did that ever like confuse? Like, did you ever stop and think, wait a minute, which side is he playing? You know?
It's really an interesting question for a few reasons because throughout, from the time the Jewish gangsters emerged on the Lower East Side, all the Jewish newspapers, and there were a significant number of them back then, Yiddish language newspapers, they had a great uh, they were humiliated by the gangsters in the community, and they wrote about it. But there was one other factor. I mean, the idea that Jewish men would be prostituting women and beating up local shop owners and doing all the things that we know they did. But there was one other factor: was all those people came from Eastern Europe, where there was anti-Semitism beyond belief. That's why they came in the millions from Eastern Europe. And now and they had no one to protect them in those little neighborhoods, those little villages. The Cossacks would kill them, rape them, do all that stuff. And when they came to the New World, there was a new generation, my Uncle George's generation, Uncle George, who were not taking that shit anymore. They were going to be on the street and fight. And when the Irish and German, we forget now, but the big immigrant groups in those, or the big ethnic groups, were German and Irish, which they aren't as much anymore in these big cities. When the anti-Semitism came out, these guys were on the street more than ready to fight. And that was the first time their parents ever saw Jews fighting in the street against non-Jewish anti-Semites. So there was a push and pull that you were just asking me about. So to me, and my mother had a comment once, an observation that my sister told me about when I was writing the book, was that my mother said, Jews don't raise their children to be criminals, meaning that those guys who were the criminals, their kids weren't going to be criminals, their kids were going to college, as a generalization. And it wasn't a put down of other ethnic groups. It was just that these men had one foot in the world you were describing of religious services and part of the culture. And the other part was, hey, they were hired killers.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a contradiction. But, yeah, a little bit. You touched upon something I want to ask, and before we end the show, before we do that, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Damn it, you brought something up,
I'm not the only one forgetting, man. That's cool.
It's something you mentioned before that was, oh, and you do mention this in the book a little bit, but it was already mentioned one time before in some documentary about how Meyer Lansky, Arnold Rothstein, and a lot of the guys from Murder Inc. used to, during the war, used to go and break up Nazi little get-togethers in New York area or any other area in America. They would go there and bust it up. And so they had a love for Israel and for the Jews overseas, what was going on during the war. Even though a lot of people said, well, these just talk bad, like Meyer's this and Meyer's that, but here he is busting up these Nazis and everything. So, did that ever come up in conversation in your household?
Many times. And it came up in the way that it wasn't just the Nazis in the mid-30s to the late 30s to before we got into the war, that the Jews, Meyer Lansky was asked by a rabbi, a well-known rabbi at the time, we got to stop these.
A real rabbi, you mean?
A what? A real rabbi in this case. A real rabbi asked him to, we got to show them that we fight. These Nazis walking the street with Nazi symbols, and they had 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, a Nazi rally. And Meyer Lansky organized both organized crime guys and guys who just wanted to fight Nazis to go out in the street. And the interesting thing about that to me was that Nazis always had this stereotype of Jews not being ready to fight. You know that kind of stereotype. And they showed these guys that not only were they ready to fight, but they were brutal. And the Nazis almost always, in every instance, ran as fast as they could. And that went back, as I wrote in the book, to Detroit. Henry Ford was one of the biggest anti-Semite in American public figure in the 20th century. He was a vile anti-Semite. I wrote the story in there, and that was Detroit was the first place to have prohibition, Michigan, and so Jewish gangs started with prohibition, and they also worked as strike. They worked for unionization. So Henry Ford wanted to show that the Jews were criminals and that they were not fighters. And boy, did they learn a lesson in Detroit. The guys who later on became the Nazis walking in the streets. So that was always out there. It was always part of our story that the Jews, including my father, going back to where his role, he wasn't, but there were guys like my father who were not part of organized crime, who went out in the street to fight Nazis too. I wrote that in the book. And,
yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
You breezed over it a little bit, yes. I remember reading about it. I remember knowing about it. I remember Maya used to organize these kind of break up this club, break up that thing.
They loved doing it. It was their pleasure to do it.
Yeah, him and Bugsy did it a lot.
That's right.
But Bugsy got a kick out of it. He would go and he loved it.
Yeah. I mean, after all, they grew up hearing about how their families were brutalized in Eastern Europe by the local citizenry, and there was no recourse. There was no one to protect them, and now things had changed.
Right, exactly. Well, listen, Alan, we can talk forever, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation, but I know we're coming close to the end of the show. It was a little bit longer than normal, but that's okay. But I want to tell everybody, show everybody, this is the book. All right, Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. Whoops, wrong way. Here we go. By Alan Geik. It's a great. I'm enjoying it. So if I'm enjoying it, you know it's got to be good.
Thank you.
Guys, where can people find it on Amazon, obviously, right?
Thank you so much.
No
and
problem.
it's on Amazon. It's on Amazon in Kindle and paperback, and it's on almost every platform you can order a book from.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Alan. And we'll definitely keep in touch as we
I hope so.
do. And I wish you a lot of luck with it, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks.
Well, thanks, guys. That was another segment of Mob Tales with Nick Christophers. I'd like to thank Alan Geik for coming on the show. We had a lot of fun. So please share, like, subscribe, and all that fun, beautiful stuff. Take care, guys.